Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Progressive American. We are streaming live here today with Bob, who also goes by the name of Mustache Mafia on YouTube. How are you doing today, Bob?
I am outstanding. I'm living free and wonderful in America. Unfortunately, I am stuck in Florida, but at least the weather's good and the beer's cheap.
Well, that is one way to put it. I know you've loved to hold Florida's weather over my life because Illinois does not have consistent weather.
I haven't worn a coat in 7 months.
You monster. So I just wanted to, if you wanted to introduce yourself, kind of some of your work and what kind of got you into politics or anything like that, feel free to do so from the start, and then we can get into the big stuff.
Yeah, sure. My name is Bob. Call me Bobby B, Mustache Bob, or the host of the wonderful Mustache Mafia show, which you should definitely like and subscribe to on YouTube. I have been political since I was about a teenager. Uh, I was kind of radicalized and politically enlightened during the Bush administration. I was about 12 or 13 on 9/11, so that was my political awakening. I kind of became involved in activism in a funny way. My first activism was actually against lowering a speed limit so that rich people could bike on the one rural road that actually goes to my house. They wanted to lower it to 25, and that would not stand. And that actually got me into looking into other ways that the society I was living in became unjust. From that, I started reading a lot of philosophy because I'm a sad nerd and I like to read depressing European post-structuralists. So from there, I kind of moved left of kind of what my upbringing was. I joined the military in my 20s, served in the global war on terror, and as a UN kind of functionary for peacekeeping missions. So I operated at a operational and a kind of a policy level in the U.S. military. That kind of opened my eyes to international injustice and the unsustainability of our current methodology of conducting capitalism, especially vis-a-vis the global South. And when I got out of the military, COVID happened, and I thought, hey, why don't I start a podcast? I got a lot of free time on my hands, and that's where I wound up today.
Yeah, I think like I don't believe I would be in any good position to serve in the military. Uh,
Mm.
I've been told I'm not deployable because of some things apparently. I would expect it would be because I'm too skinny. Like I would make early Steve Rogers look like a muscly man.
No, bro, that
Um,
that's good, bro. You can't you're skinny, so they won't hit you.
yeah.
They'll hit
with
me
my
first, man. I'm a big guy.
with my luck, I'll be walking out of the trench like with my head out and then gets knocked out because I'm 6'4". Uh, So, but no, so to kind of go back to what you were talking about in terms of your podcast and like the time that you had, would you say that part of the reason you kind of wanted to get into a podcast was not just like tied to COVID and being like having time, but also being able to like take your experiences and your perspective and use it in a way that you thought would be conducive to people who had now had time with you?
Yeah, I think that would be a much better way of putting it and a lot less self-deprecating than the way I did it, so thank you for that. Yeah, because, I'm a relatively okay orator, and I figured that, uh, I'd like to talk about a lot of these complex ideas, and one of the things that's kind of, lacking in the, quote, unquote, "discourse" that's online right now, is kind of breaking down complex ideas into a way that's accessible for, like, the common man, or the
Mm,
common person. Uh Especially in we'll be talking a little bit about military science. A lot of the ways that we interact with conflict now, especially vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine, a lot of people just don't know what they're talking about, but they sound smart, so people believe them. And then when you try to correct people's apprehensions about the way military science works, it's really difficult to communicate that to the average person in a way that they understand from their life. And I kind of feel like I'm okay at that. If I'm not, please leave mean comments on my YouTube and I'll totally read them, or tweet mean at me, and I'll try to get better. But I think that's an important project. I think you're actually pretty good at that in the stuff that you do as well. Uh,
appreciate it.
yeah, because these are not simple things that are happening, but it's important to be able to have people have accessibility to the debate. Uh, we went from the 1960s where we had like a Jean-Paul Sartre, Camus, de Beauvoir, even Heidegger were like best-selling authors. Like they were on working class people's bookshelves. And today we are so inundated with terrible media, especially like 24-hour cable news, awful right-wing quote unquote intellectuals that we'll talk about, I guess, towards the middle of this. That it's difficult to actually find good sources of information. If I can even be a small one for that, then I think it's worth my time to talk to folks on the internet.
Yeah, and that's kind of how I wanted to do this. Well, initially, like my podcast was kind of a way to get a little bit of extra time off my hands. Like I was constantly reading. Like I was one of those old people who like reads physical newspapers. As I've been told, I like my old friends are like reading the news off their phone, and I would like read the New York Times or something on like on the back porch and just like have a cup of coffee and read the news in a piece of paper. And it's like, okay, you are such an old man. That was pretty much what I got. But no, like I'd have all this time to read and go through these things, and I couldn't just like say these things to just family. I felt like there was a need to uh, sort of make it easier for people to get access to these ideas and have them summarized in a way that they can critically examine and interrogate, not just from me, but from other sources. So it's good to see that you felt the same way. But since you kind of brought up the intellectual side of things, uh, since it kind of will play into how we deal with these other issues we were mentioning,
Hmm.
it seems to me that a lot of times with the shift from like the 1960s onward, there seems to be this attempt to individualize uh, intellectualism. This need to make the individual completely separate from their environment, as if somebody learning from their environment is condemning their ability to learn as a people.
Yeah, like I think Thatcher kind of said that like society was a myth. I believe that was Margaret Thatcher, but I could be wrong. I think that's kind of part of the neoliberal order that's kind of developed since then, to atomize society and break it down to just like the individual consumer. It's not a very healthy way to have a society, but I think with the intellectual sphere, I think the more deadly thing that we've been dealing with is what Adorno called the culture industry in a book called Dialectic of Enlightenment, which is a killer book. Um, Instead of having art or news, in this case, that uplifts you and makes you think and examine the world around you, what we've got is an industrial culture machine that turns out products that are meant to just be consumed and not meant to be considered. So when we have something like, say, cable news, uh,
Hmm.
you have these machines that are essentially designed to provoke an emotional response that over time almost becomes addictive. If you ever see somebody who watches a lot of Fox News, they're almost like dependent on it emotionally. It's because Fox News is specifically designed to produce certain emotional responses, most notably like rage and disgust. You'll notice that a lot with like
Yeah.
modern right wingers. So instead of like making a complicated news product to actually like uplift somebody and inform them, they're making something that's just commercial and meant to be consumed and create this emotional response that over time people become dependent on. And Fox News isn't the only one doing this. All of the major cable news outlets will do this, and a lot of places on the internet do this. YouTube's kind of famous for it with the algorithm to keep you watching, to keep you getting that same emotional response that you like to click on. And that creates an environment where instead of creating intellectual debate or intellectual content for you to kind of consider, like the public intellectual that Hume described, uh, you get just these kind of charlatans who are just in it for the clicks and the money. And that drags down our discourse. And it's really not good. We can see the effects of it around us every day.
And I was just thinking about this as an example. Is like there was a draft in the Nixon library before Fox News was really established, but it was originally proposed by Roger Ailes, and it was called "A Plan to Get the GOP on TV." I'm paraphrasing the title there, but
I've actually seen the original document.
oh, you've seen the original document.
Yeah,
I've
they'll
only
show it
got
to
the
you if you
scan.
go. Yeah, they'll show it to you if you go to the library. It's really cool. It's actually a cool library.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, and like it's interesting in like its historical significance, but terrifying in the fact that he literally outlines what he meant Fox News to be. In that he says that with cable news, you don't have to do the thinking is done for you.
Exactly, and you're tuning in to have someone do that thinking for you and to kind of approve what you already think of.
Yeah, and that's where it's like I think like kind of goes back to your mentioning of public like intellectuals like Jordan Peterson, who like appeal to this idea of hyper individualism and all these little aesthetics, but doesn't
Yeah.
actually make any material improvement in the lives of the people around them because he's just here to sell his next book.
Yeah, exactly. He's an I wouldn't even call him a public intellectual. I'd call him an entertainer, which he does. Uh, and he does. I wish he did in a way that didn't encourage his people to go down a fascist right wing rabbit hole, um, or to eat a lot of raw meat. Even though I love steak, man, but like eating all steak and salt's not good for you. And if you find your guru is telling you to eat all steak and salt, you might want to look around for a new guru. Also, if your guru is like Peterson, parroting the cultural Marxism conspiracy theory, which has its origins in a certain German political movement from the 1920s and 30s, you might want to re-examine your guru. But kind of
Yeah.
one of the problems that we have now is that people don't know that. And it's probably a bad thing for our society that we don't.
Well, and the other thing is, I think part of the issue is that people look for gurus themselves rather than looking at these figures as resources to be used critically and compared to other public figures. Like, I don't want anybody to just watch my show and be like, Connor knows everything about this and that, because quite frankly, that means they're not going to critically examine anything if they're just listening to me. But if, like, say, they're listening to opposition views who come on my show, then they've got resources that they can use, or somebody else who is in debate with me or something like that.
Yeah, that's a very good philosophy, man. And it's something that you won't see from the Jordan Petersons of the world. I mean, he did one debate with an actual opposition figure, and it was Slavoj Zizek and Zizek, and he got spanked so bad that he like disappeared from the public eye for a year because it turned out he had never actually read any Marx. Like he's having a debate with a Marxist philosopher, and Zizek is asking him like, "Oh, what have you read of Marx?" And he's like, "Well, I read the manifesto last week." It's just he just got exposed, bro. It was really rough. Like I almost felt bad for him watching that debate.
It's one of those things where it's like, yeah, you can like even then, like even if you like read it in college, that doesn't
Mm.
necessarily mean you're an expert on it or you've like examined the critical elements of it and the historical context of it either. Because like a lot of philosophy has a context that is specifically meant to address, or political ideology in a similar way. Um, but to kind of turn this towards what we were going to talk about with what's going on in Ukraine, do you think some of that media environment kind of in both online and in cable news has contributed to sort of a misunderstanding of what's going on in Ukraine and like almost balkanized the discourse on it?
Well, partially, yeah, because we've so there's a lot of elements to this. We'll go over kind of just what's happening in America right now first. I
Mm-hmm.
think would be a good way to start. In America, we've been lurching to the right, I would argue, since like the 1960s with like the Nixon Revolution, as Nixon's far right brand of politics kind of took over the Republican Party from the Eisenhower wing. And we've lurched so far to the right in this country that we elected a president from 2016 to 2020 who shall not be named, uh, who who was broadly sympathetic to far right figures, including Jair Bolsonaro, who's basically a fascist in Brazil. And if you think I'm using the fascist word too much, the dude was literally involved with the military junta in Brazil
Yeah.
and is in favor of torture and murder. The guy's a bad guy. He was broadly sympathetic to Kim Jong Un, bizarrely because he's an authoritarian, and he was especially sympathetic. And I'm not doing the Russiagate thing, but he really was very sympathetic to Vladimir Putin. So we have in the United States a failed right-wing movement that's broadly sympathetic to authoritarianism, especially right-wing authoritarianism. So that base is going to be catered to by a for-profit culture industry that wants them to consume products. So you're going to see guys like Tucker Carlson get on Fox News, and initially when Ukraine was invaded illegally by Russia, he said that he was rooting for Russia, which is a monstrous thing to say, but it was disquieting for me to actually hear that said on American broadcast news that somebody's rooting for an illegal invasion of another nation, because that's not who we're supposed to be as a country. I think
Yeah.
you'll agree. I mean, we don't always live up to that, so don't get me wrong. Some people might say the Iraq War kind of puts a bit of a lie to that, but that's not who we're supposed to be as a country. So we have ideological co-travelers with Putin's far-right regime in Russia here, and we're seeing a lot of that. The other thing is, are you familiar with the concept of dime?
You could go into a little more detail. I'm probably gonna mess it up.
Yeah, so in military science, I think it's a political science term too. I think I've heard it crossed over. When you look at national power, there's an acronym called DIME, and it stands for diplomacy, information, military, and economics. And as we're going through this in the United States, in Russia, we have a regime that tries to use each of those elements to project its power and its ideology internationally, and they use all of those elements in concert. So where the United States kind of uses diplomacy on its own, or sometimes economics on its own, or kinetic force kind of on its own, the Russian state is committed to using all of those together. So when they try to assert power over Eastern Europe, they'll do a lot of disinformation, they'll do a lot of diplomacy, and they'll do a lot of economic leveraging, like when they cut Bulgaria off from heating oil, or Ukraine off from heating oil, which is a big deal economically and diplomatically. So we have Russia contributing to this because, as part of that dime concept, they're using their total state apparatus to project their ideology and favorable opinions about them to the world. So they'll put out information that's favorable to them, that's far right wing, that's sympathetic to people in this country who are already far right wing and sympathize with the Putin administration. So it's not like some people, especially kind of liberals over the last 4 years, have thought that like the FSB, which replaced the KGB, is like puppet mastering everybody at Fox News. And really, it's kind of more like they're just ideological co-travelers and they're meshing. So that's kind of what we're seeing, I think, in the news right now.
And kind of to go on off of that a bit, because it does seem to me that there is a certain element on the right that really does admire and almost like adore Putin and the symbolism of this machismo that he kind of tries to give off, without considering the consequences of what he actually does. In particular, you mentioned Tucker Carlson, who,
Mm.
as you are likely aware, his lawyers had to admit in court that nobody should take what he says seriously, and they got him off of a lawsuit over that because the idea was that no reasonable person would take him seriously. But in terms of how that affects our ability to respond, how our domestic politics will influence our foreign response. Do you think that that kind of misinformation, that kind of adulation of a foreign power, could lead to problems in our reaction to Ukraine, or what would they cause in any way, shape, or form?
In the long term, it worries me a lot, because that Trump, God, I named him. I was going to try to be clever and not name him the whole time. That wing of the Republican Party, which I'll try not to name again, um, is increasingly becoming the mainstream of the party. I say a lot that I don't believe that there's much of an alt-right anymore. I think they're becoming the mainstream of the Republican Party. As that happens, it's going to be a serious problem. Hopefully, we can make those people politically irrelevant before that happens. I did notice that Mitch McConnell said that that wasn't the stance of the Republican Party, but increasingly he's losing his grip on the fringes. Uh, I think the vast majority of the American people support the free people of Ukraine fighting off of imperialistic invasion from the Russian Federation. So I don't think it'll have any immediate effect, but in the long term, I worry that we have a populist right in this country that is going to be very sympathetic to other imperial ambitions, maybe of Russia or other right-wing regimes in the future.
And I will say, like, we've already seen some element of the American right wing influencing other countries' politics or responses to other countries' politics. Like, for example, when I was talking to Jody from Imperial News about the so-called Freedom Convoy in Canada, one of the things that was brought up is that a large portion of the donations that were sent to support that convoy were from Americans, American officials, American people. Like it was. So that's the one side of it. But on the other side, I do think that there's also an element of almost reactionary isolationism, which is like, why do we care about what's going on over there? We've got these SJWs, these woke schools or whatever. And that to me is concerning, because any attempt to consider war crimes or maintain strong international institutions that are supposed to not only hold us accountable, but hold other countries to account will falter if the United States does not have some cooperative approach with other countries.
Yeah, isolationism in the 21st century, there's like some sentiment towards it, but it's basically impossible at this point. I know the argument was made before World War One, but our economies internationally are so intertwined that we'll see that the price of bread is going to go up in the United States because of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. Because pretty much everything that we have in this neoliberal world order is sold on a global market. So our economies are hopelessly intertwined. Our politics are intertwined, and the things that allowed the United States to be the things that allowed the United States and other nations to be isolationist in the past, which are mostly like vast distances between them and near peer or peer rivals, aren't the same barriers that they used to be. The Atlantic Ocean isn't the barrier that it was in like the 1780s. Back in the day when it would take like 6 months to cross the ocean. Now we have intercontinental ballistic missiles that can cross that distance in minutes. Now we have an internet that you can communicate instantaneously to pretty much anybody in the world as long as the internet's relatively free in their country. Isolationism itself isn't really possible. What worries me about those right-wing figures is that they have an ideology of American unilateralism and American supremacy that isn't rooted in material reality. A lot of our power internationally, as the United States, comes from coalitions like NATO that we'll talk about later, approval from the United Nations, various other alliances and partnerships that we have. For instance, when we invaded Iraq in 2003, which was a very bad idea, it was about 330,000 troops that accomplished that invasion. 190,000 of them were American, and the rest were coalition allies and Kurds. So the idea that America can act unilaterally, effectively, kinetically on its own, it's a fantasy of right-wing people that are projecting this kind of like macho movie mentality onto global affairs. We're seeing how that's failing for the Russians in Ukraine, since they built their military around that, and it's failing. But we've also seen it throughout history. I know you're a big history guy. I mean, you can talk about the Habsburgs trying to like take over Europe. We can talk about Napoleon failing to live in a world order. What we have to realize is that we live. Henry Kissinger is a very evil man, but he put it very well in a book called World Order. We kind of live in a new Westphalian world order that's based on sovereignty, where we respect the sovereignty of other nations so long as it doesn't upset the international order. And we're starting to see coalitions kind of form around that. And I'm very glad that the guy who I'm trying not to name is out of office, because when he was in office, those coalitions were kind of weakening a little. They were weakening to the point where France and Germany were considering a separate alliance from NATO to confront totalitarianism and unilateralism in Europe. But we've worked a little bit to repair that, and we need to keep working to repair those coalitions. And again, we need to make the people that think that the United States acts unilaterally and imperially kind of politically marginal or irrelevant in our system in order to do that. I hope I didn't throw too much jargon at that one.
No, that's good. I would just like to kind of get into this since you brought up NATO.
Yeah.
So, from your perspective and from what you've kind of described thus far, you don't see NATO so much as necessarily an imperialist force, obviously, because you've said before that you support its continuation, but you see it as sort of a bulwark against unilateral political influence, correct?
Yeah, so NATO, was formed after World War II, right? It's formed around, ironically, I always would think it would be Article 1, but it's Article 5 of the NATO Charter, is the common defense. Attack against one NATO member is an attack against all of them. NATO was formed, yes, to preserve capitalism and the capitalist bloc, but it was also formed as a institution that could expand based on having a country be admitted by unilateral or not unilateral, unanimous vote of all of the NATO members. It's an organization that has included former rivals. It's an organization that now includes France and Germany. 100 years ago, if somebody told you that France and Germany were going to be in a military alliance with England and Italy and the United States and Spain or in Romania, you would look at them sideways. Well, one, because Romania. Actually, no, Romania did exist about 100 years ago, but you'd look at them sideways because France and Germany being in an alliance is kind of crazy. Uh,
For
and
obvious reasons.
for obvious reasons, 100 years ago. Um, it's kind of expanded also to the point where it could act as kind of a European Union army for its common defense. It acts in accordance, in concert, a lot of times with European Union political decisions. It's allowed the NATO members to actually use common gear and make common plans in order to preserve their sovereignty instead of competing against each other. For instance, after or prior to and after World War One, the UK actually thought they were going to go to war with us at some point. But post World War II, they've never really worried about going to war with us because we've been in this grand alliance. So it's taken all of these great powers and put them together. Is that always a great thing? Not necessarily, because NATO has done some bad things, but overall, as an institution now, it's a good institution because we have Russia that's drifted way far to the right wing and has a regime in Vladimir Putin's regime that has an explicit policy goal of actually reuniting the old Soviet republics and stomping on the sovereignty of Eastern Europe. Uh, in the face of that, it's probably good to have a common defense. NATO's expanded to include countries like Poland and Romania. I believe it's 30 members now. And having a common defense against imperialist aggression like that, that preserves the sovereignty of its members, is a worthwhile goal. It also stopped a genocide in the 90s in the former Yugoslavia. So NATO doesn't always do bad things. In that regard, it's also kind of it got a little weaker after the end of the Cold War because the NATO members right after the Cold War had what they kind of called a peace dividend. Right after the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of NATO members, including us, like massively downsized militaries and their basing, especially in Eastern Europe. And after Afghanistan ended, they were kind of looking at doing another peace dividend where they were kind of going to draw down even more. And like, while it's not the folded gap anymore, we're not worried that the USSR is going to like roll tanks through Central Europe. Uh, that might not have been the best idea, but it's still a worthwhile institution to have, I think. Before I ramble off too much, because I could go on about NATO for days.
Oh, I'm sure. But to kind of go off of that a little more,
Hmm.
because one of the arguments that I heard and I've heard before, and I'm sure you've heard, is that NATO, for one, has a habit of intervening in other countries. You mentioned Yugoslavia, and then
Hmm.
one of the arguments to show like interventionism never works, or as the argument can go in a simplified manner, is Libya. And I was
Well,
wondering your thoughts on that particular incident because it does kind of play into how a lot of people who are frustrated or otherwise opposed to NATO and the United States react to the current situation.
yeah, Libya was an absolute disaster. I'll fully admit that. The only organization that's doing like worthwhile work in Libya now is UNSMIL, which is the UN peacekeeping mission in Libya, and even they're not really able to kind of clamp down the country and return it to the global fold as much as they should. At the same time, one failure doesn't really negate the necessity of the NATO alliance. Uh, they should definitely learn their lesson from that. Toppling a government without a viable alternative or a popular movement in the country to replace that government isn't a great idea. Uh, I don't see how that like invalidates NATO. I mean, NATO just carried on a 20-year campaign in Afghanistan, and it still has relevance for that. NATO countries are in assisting various different peacekeeping missions through the UN. France, notably in Mali, Central African Republic, have stopped actual civil wars and genocide over the last few years. Uh, NATO provides a bulwark again against expansionist aggression from countries like Russia. Right now, we're dealing explicitly in the Ukraine with an expansionist Russia trying to kind of roll over another country, and NATO and American, well, we're part of NATO, so I guess we count. NATO aid is directly checking that, and NATO's military power uh, is an incentive for Russia not to be aggressive diplomatically, because we'll see the Finland and Sweden are being kind of driven to join NATO to protect themselves from Russia, whereas individually those countries could be more vulnerable to Russian or any kind of right-wing aggression in that region. I don't see how Libya invalidates the need for NATO. It's definitely a black mark on the alliance. It's definitely a black mark on our foreign policy, and it's definitely a black mark on foreign interventionism. I think that part of intervening in another country at this point should kind of be predicated on how the country is affecting world order, the world economy, and the sovereignty of other nations, instead of kind of just toppling a government because you can. It's
Hmm.
kind of an interesting question.
And it's one of those things where you, for one, you also have to balance the issue of whether or not said toppling it constitutes a war of aggression in and of itself. Um,
Absolutely.
but on the other front, I wanted to kind of get into the NATO relationship with Russia.
Mm,
You and I have had this conversation before, and I had it uh, earlier on my last podcast. Was this question of whether or not NATO promised uh, Russia, uh, well, technically the Soviet Union at the time, that it
mm.
wouldn't expand eastward. And I wanted to get your kind of understanding of it, because I know I've gone on my share of comments about it, but I'd like to get some of your insights.
Yeah, the way I understand it, was kind of like an informal agreement at a conference. I believe it was Gorbachev and a State Department official, where the guy's like, "Yeah, we don't have any interest in expanding eastward." Even if it was a formal agreement, if Russia really doesn't want countries on its border to join NATO, a good way to guarantee that would be to not be aggressive militarily and diplomatically towards those countries. Uh, Russia's probably the biggest offender in driving countries to be closer to the West and be closer to NATO, because it's used its military like what, 3 times in the last 10 years to abrogate internationally recognized borders. They invaded Georgia, and they still occupy South Ossetia. They invaded the Crimea after the Revolution of Dignity in the Ukraine, and they've invaded the Donbass. They did have a co-defense agreement with Kazakhstan, but they crushed a revolution in Kazakhstan this year, and now they're invading explicitly the Ukraine. If you're playing kind of game theory as a armchair diplomat in say Finland, for the sake of argument, that would drive me to want to join NATO too, because I don't want to be an individual country that can just be rolled over when I can be part of a coalition. If Russia is really concerned about its security and they think NATO is a security threat to them, then being a rogue actor and upsetting Westphalian international order at this point is a strategic blunder on their part, and we're seeing the consequences of that. As there's over 5,500 sanctions on Russia at this point, the Russian ruble is actually worth less than the Afghani Afghan, which is their currency in Afghanistan. A bunch of Russians have tried to flee the country, um, and their economy is just not going to be able to sustain uh, flouting international order like this. And if they didn't want that to happen, then they shouldn't have been aggressive in the first place.
Mm. So basically, your whole point is, yeah, maybe there were these statements, but whether
Mm,
or not they were legally binding, whether or not they were representative of the government's positions that were
mm.
involved, the fact of the matter remains that Russia retains an aggressive attitude that incentivizes the very thing they wanted to avoid in the first place.
Yeah, and Ukraine's not the only country that's feeling this. The Baltic states are definitely feeling this too. Most notably, the Baltic states are actually contributing now to NATO's Joint Tactical Command and Cyber Warfare commands, because they're worried about the same Russian aggression. Uh, Belarus is basically their only ally in that area, because they're also kind of authoritarian co-travelers with them. But yeah, they're kind of bringing this on themselves. They also did agree to respect Ukraine's sovereignty in exchange for Ukraine giving up the Soviet-era nuclear weapons that existed in that country, and they haven't exactly done that. If they respected their sovereignty, they would have allowed Ukraine to sign the European trade deal, which triggered this whole thing, and not invade the Crimea illegally. if they really wanted to respect or if they really wanted Ukraine to be an authentic ally to them, they would carry out diplomacy and show that they're a genuine partner to Ukraine instead of being an imperial overlord. But when you have a strongman government that has an expansionist policy, you're going to get kind of bad results when you try to have friendly diplomatic relations with your neighbors. The other thing is that the brutal form of Russian kleptocracy that the Putin government's carried out over the last few years is a form of capitalism that always needs a frontier. So it's basically kind of stolen most of what it's going to steal from the Russian economy, and now it needs a frontier. And the Ukraine has a pretty vibrant, or did before Russia started blowing it up, have a pretty vibrant and pretty decent economy going. So it's a juicy target for them to kind of gobble up and keep in their sphere. But if they didn't want Ukraine to join NATO again, they shouldn't have invaded it. They shouldn't have driven them to it.
And to kind of go off of that into a little bit of a different point, one of the criticisms that I have heard, and I'm sure you've heard this, is the issue of the aid that the lethal aid that the United States and NATO allies are providing to Ukraine, and where that aid will end up. Particularly concerns surrounding the Azov Battalion, the Three Finger Party, and the Banderas. And one of the things I was hoping you could kind of speak to is what would be the proper response to try and protect Ukraine's sovereignty and its ability to defend itself as guaranteed under the United Nations Charter, while also avoiding sort of radicalizing the region with heavily armed neo-Nazis.
So the Azov Battalion and the other Nazi elements that exist out there, they're very bad. They worry me a lot, and I'll start off to telling you why they worry me. They're not going to take over the Ukrainian government or any vast stretch of territory. The Azov Battalion, I believe, is only about 2,500 people strong, and there's probably over 100,000 Ukrainian fighters right now. It's hard to know because they use so many irregulars. They're not going to take over the Ukrainian government. What worries me about Azov is that a lot of neo-Nazis and fascists are going to rotate through that and take the skills they learn in this as a training kernel and spread them to other countries, especially here in the United States, where we have a real problem with right-wing terrorism. You can look up the FBI statistics on that one if you're not clear on it. The lethal aid, you know, I'm trying to find a very delicate way to say this. We need to flood that area with weapons so that they can defend themselves from imperialist aggression. What comes after that is going to be decades of trying to clean up the aftermath of that, because we're going to have unexploded ordnance. A lot of rockets just don't go off. A lot of bombs get dropped and stay in the ground. Landmines will be laid. Improvised explosive devices will be placed that are just going to be sitting around. We're going to need to clean those up. The country is now flooded with rifles and anti-tank shoulder-mounted weaponry, surface-to-air missiles, and tanks. The Pandora's box has kind of been opened on that one. You're going to be seeing weapons from this probably turn up for decades. World War II, there are still rifles from World War II turning up in Syria right now. They actually found like caches of STG-44s and FG-42s from World War II in Syria. It's kind of almost unavoidable. The goal right now should be to stop Russia's imperialist invasion of the Ukraine. And then afterwards, we should be planning for it now, but afterwards we're going to have a program where those weapons are taken out of the hands of non-government actors, especially dangerous ones like the Azov Battalion. The other thing that worries me about the current situation is that situations of national peril, like an invasion, tend to bring out reactionary right-wing reactions in any country. There was a real huge right-wing reaction in my lifetime after 9/11 when we were attacked. 1941 in Pearl Harbor, there was a pretty big nationalist reaction in this country after that. The Soviet Union in World War II had a very big nationalist reaction to that event. And the Ukrainians are going to be going through that for the next few years. And we also want to engage diplomatically using soft power as much as possible to ensure that the Ukrainians transition away from this period and into a constructive period of democratic and, for lack of a better term, liberal rule, as opposed to kind of going down the road that Russia went down after the fall of the Soviet Union. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be giving them lethal aid, because they're facing down over 200,000 Russians with thousands of armored vehicles, trucks, modern fighter planes, and they need to be able to defend themselves. So that lethal aid is an absolute moral necessity, in my opinion, uh, for the Ukrainians. The only thing that worries me now is that we're giving them so many javelins, AT-4s, and anti-tank missiles that we're giving them faster than they're actually produced. So I'm worried that we're going to run down the stock to the point where we don't have any more to give them. But I think Russia will probably run out of steam long before that happens, hopefully.
So to kind of paraphrase this and
Mm.
summarize it in a way, you do share some of the concerns of the critics of the lethal aid in that these far right individuals and these groups could pose a threat. They're not necessarily going to overtake the entire government, but
Yeah.
they will be a long-term problem. Um, but at the same time, the severity of the invasion and the death that comes from that invasion requires a military response.
Yeah, well, I mean, like during World War II, when we flooded France with all kinds of weapons for the resistance, a lot of those weapons were turning up in the hands of criminals or terrorists decades after World War II, but it was still an imperative to arm the people resisting Germany's invasion of France. In Afghanistan, we armed the Mujahideen so they could defend Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. That didn't work out too well for us because I've literally been shot at by some of those guns myself. Uh, but it was considered an imperative at that time to arm those guys. Anytime that you just flood an area with guns, they don't just come back. Ireland in the 1920s actually bought more Tommy guns than the U.S. military did for a while. No, no kidding. You can actually look up. There's an old IRA song that's recorded on like an old phonograph of a guy singing about how great his Tommy gun is, and weapons from like the Troubles and the Irish Revolution are still turning up occasionally today. There was just a couple months ago, some Irish farmer found like a cache of AKs sitting out in the field. But it's kind of an inevitability, and it's one of the horrors of war. Why you should never actually want to go to war, and why you should never actually want a war to happen, is that um, that lethal aid, in our case, or just the flooding of an area with weapons, leads to violence for like decades afterwards. And I would blame Russia more than us because it wouldn't be necessary to be giving people javelins, millions of dollars worth of rifles, if it wasn't for the imperialist invasion. Another good thing, though, that I did want to mention that we're doing with our aid package, that not a lot of people have been talking about, but I find very interesting, is that the Russian Air Force was actually dependent on our GPS system to fly. So we've cut them off from that GPS and that SATCOM. So the Russian pilots actually have to punch in coordinates like by hand on their aircraft, and they can't use their radar guided or their satellite guided munitions as well. So that's another good aspect of the aid that we're doing that not a lot of people are talking about, and I find kind of almost hilarious because these modern fighter planes that they have, they don't know where they're going without our SATCOM.
So, and then that kind of ties into what I was going to go into next, which is kind of this cutting Russia off through sanctions, through changes in trade relations, and businesses separating. One of the things that I've always kind of been reticent to do is general sanctions against like doing business with Russia, in part because innocent people get caught in it. And one of the arguments that I've heard, and you have also heard, likely heard, is the idea that the sanctions won't stop Russia. It won't cause Putin to collapse. It'll just anger the people and cause them to blame us. And I was wondering if you could like kind of hit on that because that has happened before with other countries, but I'm wondering, it does seem a little distinct in this case to me.
It does. You know, they are staging pro-Putin rallies in Russia, so it's hard to gauge what's going on since the state media controls a lot of that. But it seems from the people that I've talked to who live in Russia or have family in Russia that a lot of people do actually blame the Putin government for these sanctions. The good thing about sanctions is that sanctioning a country's economy is a lot better than dropping a JDAM on them. Um, so there's that, and it takes a lot of money to maintain an army in the field. And like we were talking, the Russian government tries to use that dime philosophy to use its total state apparatus to wage warfare. And if we kind of shut down their economic ability a little bit, it might, or will probably, uh, hamper their ability to field troops. They're losing armor. If you've been paying attention to this, armored assets and trucks to the point where they're bringing in civilian trucks and they're bringing out old training tanks right now. And each one of those tanks costs like over $10 million to make. So if we're sanctioning their economy and their economy is already only the size of Texas, they're not going to be able to replace that war material. They're not going to be able to carry out as aggressive of actions. There are bad things about sanctions. That's true. One of the bad things about sanctions is you're right. It hurts civilians. It makes innocent people's lives worse. And the Russian and the international economy have taken a hit. If you bought gas lately, you've definitely felt it. Yeah, I mean it's like 375 here. It just came down a little bit. So
It is
uh,
so much worse here.
yeah, I bet it's like 450, right?
Something like that. 450,
Yeah,
440.
yeah,
It shifts.
yeah. It's rough. But again, it's kind of better than going to direct warfare. Uh, the other bad thing about sanctions is if Russia does overcome these sanctions and accomplishes its objectives, which God willing seems unlikely at this point, it does damage the credibility of the sanctioning body. Like, oh yeah, sure, you're going to sanction me again, and I'm just going to do what I want. But the sanctions seem to be working because the Russian ruble is now worth less than the Afghani. So the 1,000 Afghans I have in my house, which is Afghan currency, I don't actually have 1,000 Afghans living with me, are now are now worth significantly more than 1,000 rubles, which I don't want to be offensive to the Afghan people, but their economy is not in great shape, and the Russian currency has crashed, and their ability to buy foreign assets is crashing. I think one of the mistakes that we're making with the sanctions is that we didn't sanction Putin personally and directly, but it is a good idea to cripple their ability to wage war economically as much as possible and to isolate them as much as possible so that they can't draw economic resources to feed into their war machine and wage this illegal war.
And that's kind of like I've struggled with this because on the one hand, you never want to target innocent people if you can help it.
No.
It's one of those things where innocent people who just want to go to work or use their credit card or whatever try to go and use the tram and just want to go, and they can't because say Visa pulls out or something.
Right.
That does hurt people. But at the
But
same time, that guy who uses the money that he like uses that visa for also will go to the Russian government at some point, which will be used to buy a tank, which will be used to shoot on at an apartment complex in
right.
Mariupol.
Right. And as bad as it is for the Russian people to suffer economically with these sanctions, it is much worse for that tank to put a shell through a civilian apartment building. Uh, the reality is when you wage kind of a total war, the totality of your society is involved in it, from the person working in the shop to, you're right, the guy riding the tram to the person buying groceries. It's a aspect, it's a totality. It's a totality of the nation that's actually waging a war. Clausewitz, Karl von Clausewitz, who wrote a great book called On War, which is a book that if you're reading, if you're listening to this, you should definitely read at some point. It is, I'm going to warn you in advance, extraordinarily dry in German, written in the 1800s, but it's still a very valid book in military science. He says that war is the continuation of politics through other means, meaning violence, which we can see Russia's politics of restoring the glory of the Soviet Union or the glory of Tsarist Russia, depending on kind of who you're talking to or when Putin's lying to you, has led to them actually going kinetic and invading Ukraine. And we can also see another one of Clausewitz's sayings, war is a duel on a larger scale. So if you think of Ukraine and Russia as a totality, they're basically fighting a duel and using the totality of their societies to actually engage each other. Does that make sense? Am I?
Yeah, no, you're hitting on that point to the
Hmm.
T, and I think that's one of the things that I think a lot of Americans and a lot of people around the world don't fully understand because it's been a while since we've like at least a lot of Western nations, as
Right.
a bit outdated the term Western nations is,
Yeah,
have not had to deal. Oh, go ahead.
it's a placeholder. It's a placeholder that works every now and then. But yeah,
Yeah. It's one of those things where we, like at least in America, do not have a lot of experience as individuals with warfare. The vast majority of the public is civilian. So we're
right,
dealing with this somewhat from an armchair perspective. And now we're actually seeing total war up front in a way that it isn't a place that we just turned a blind eye to. We've seen total war in the Middle East to some extent, but it's we've honestly turned a blind eye because part of our society has a race attitude towards our foreign policy. But it's disturbing, and it's just frontness to me.
Well, we've also been waging for the last 20 years a counterinsurgency, which is actually a problem for NATO, because NATO's kind of having to pivot back to kind of great power conflict. But we've been waging a counterinsurgency, which is a low intensity conflict. Iraq and Afghanistan were horrific conflicts that claimed way too many lives, but they weren't kind of like this, where there's front lines, huge artillery bombardments, and giant tank battles. And so, yeah, you're right. We're seeing kind of the horror of war with modern weapons in a way that we haven't seen in a long time. And yeah, you're right. There is definitely a white supremacist kind of attitude towards this. One of the most disgusting things coming out of this was I saw, I believe it was on CNN, a reporter saying that the refugees coming out of Ukraine looked, they were white and Christian, so they were good refugees. It was a very, very disturbing thing for me to hear that. Um, and it kind of exposes kind of the monstrousness of our foreign policy apparatus, that's an attitude that someone was comfortable saying on television. But yeah, you're right. This is actually showing people the horror of uh, conventional warfare that we haven't seen, at least in Europe, in many years. The last huge conventional war I can think of, I guess, would be Desert Storm or the Iran-Iraq War. There's probably been one since then that I'm missing here. Uh, but we didn't pay much attention to those because it didn't affect us. This one's affecting people's prices at the gas pump. It's playing into people's racial attitudes, for better or worse. And it's making people worried about World War III because Russia is a nuclear armed power. One of the things I did want to talk to you about, I wanted to get your opinion on, was the no-fly zone thing. What did you think about that?
I have friends who support it. I have
Hmm.
friends who 100% think it's a bad idea. My attitude towards this is a no-fly zone would likely lead to a direct escalation with Russia. Um, though I'm not entirely sure how I feel about whether or not Putin would use nukes, because it's kind of hard to gauge his mindset. Anytime you're dealing with a dictatorship of one,
Right.
the mindset of the person is kind of important. For me, I oppose it, but I am not opposed to sending them more advanced weapons to like help them clear the skies more,
I,
because
I, I 100% agree with you.
like, to me, I think the best thing the United States can do, and as painful as it is to say this, because like Ukraine is literally being destroyed,
Mm.
there can't be an escalation that is so direct that it would destroy not just Ukraine, but pretty much every other country in Eastern Europe, if not the world. And that's assuming nukes are involved on that last comment.
I think if you have a direct power confrontation between the United States and Russia, you have to assume at some point it will go nuclear, because there are very rarely cases of direct warfare situations where one country holds back its strategic weaponry. Although we haven't had a giant war between two nuclear armed powers since the invention of the bomb, that's not something that I think we can risk. So I also oppose a no-fly zone, but I do 100% support sending them more surface-to-air assets, and maybe more air-to-air assets if they can, if they have the ability to field them, because the airfields are kind of taking hits over there. But if they can field fighter jets, I would definitely support sending them those. And I think that's something that, again, that's something good that NATO can do, because NATO has kind of standard weaponry. We have standard missiles. We have standard magazines for our rifles. We can kind of just have multiple countries sending Ukraine aid that's kind of cross
Intuitive
compatible
to
with each
use.
other. Yeah. Well, I mean, if you pick up well, the French switched to the HK416. So if you picked up a French rifle now, it's the same rifle that an American's carrying. But if you picked up a British rifle, and you picked up an American M4, they both use the same 5.56 magazine. It was a big deal in the 50s that we had like the standardized agreement between everybody's weapons, same bullets. So our anti-tank systems are very similar to each other. Our armor is different, but it's similar. So we can actually send kind of compatible aid from 30 different NATO countries. The other thing I kind of wanted to talk to you a little bit about that's not in the news right now, is that there's a big disruption economically with Russia occupying the Crimea, that people aren't really talking about. because the Crimea can essentially act as a mobile fires platform. Basically, Russia can put surface to air and ship to or surface to ship assets on the Crimea and kind of
Mm.
close down the Black Sea, which seems to kind of be a goal that Putin has. They've already shot down one civilian airliner since 2014. I think you remember that one.
Yeah, yeah, yep.
And allowing a rogue nation to kind of shut down the Black Sea that services Romania, Turkey, Georgia, Bulgaria, Ukraine, and Russia, and has billions of dollars of international trade along it, is not an acceptable outcome, not just for the Ukrainians, but for the world. We can't allow people to close down sea lanes via rogue invasion. So NATO needs to kind of be able to defend its member nations, which includes Turkey and Romania. So in this case, it's a good thing that NATO kind of exists, because we've got Romania and Turkey that would have trouble probably defending themselves against Russia individually, but because they're protected by the NATO agreement, we kind of mitigate having Russia have all of these fire assets on the Crimean Peninsula.
Well, and
And
I'd
the
also.
Russian,
Oh, go
sorry.
ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, and I'd also say that like that kind of plays into into what I was kind of trying to say, and I know I've mentioned this before in some varying comments I have made about a certain YouTuber that I know.
Hmm.
I will not be naming names today. But one of the arguments for the invasion or the annexation of Crimea was that the Crimeans wanted it, or that there was a serious Nazi problem. And we mentioned that there is a problem. But I also think what you mentioned earlier about closing off the Black Sea, gaining greater control of that region, and establishing naval control,
Yeah.
and the leasing of the naval base in Crimea was kind of a key component, I think, to this larger conflict that I think Putin really saw as his strategic goal.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a multi-hundred-year kind of thing for the Russians to have warm water ports for their navy, and they've fought over the Crimean Peninsula multiple times. That, of course, does not give them a right to the Crimean Peninsula. I've actually heard that argument where some people are saying that, like, oh, Crimea used to be part of Russia. Well, no, it's not anymore. The United States used to be part of Great Britain, but we're not going to all start singing "God Save the Queen" and drinking tea.
I prefer coffee, thank you very much.
Exactly. That is actually how kind of coffee became popularized. But
Yeah,
somebody else made the argument that like the Kievan Rus were like the spiritual ancestors of the Russian state, and therefore the Russians had a entitlement to the Ukrainian area because Kiev used to be like kind of the capital of the Slavic people. That's insane. You can't violate a country's sovereignty because of that. If you could, then Italy would try to roll tanks over the Alps and invade France again. There's no cogent good argument for the aggression that Russia's doing right now, and the people who are supporting curate your media feed. This is a great opportunity for, if you're listening to this, curate your media feed. If people that you're listening to and taking seriously are saying that Russia's in the right to do an expansionist war of aggression where they're bombing children's hospitals, blowing up apartment buildings, doing God knows what other war crimes, that might be a person that you shouldn't be taking seriously. People are showing you who they are. The Koch brothers, for instance, didn't divest. There's a lot of people on they're calling them the authoritarian left. I think they're just right wingers who like Stalinist aesthetics, are supporting Putin's invasion because they think he's building socialism, because they don't know what socialism is. Curate your media feed. And if you're listening to somebody who's supporting essentially wars of conquest and war crimes, maybe cut that person out of your media diet. That's probably the best thing that you can do in America right now, other than lobbying your representatives to increase aid and solidarity with the Ukrainian people, because they're fighting for their freedom, but they're also fighting against a war of expansion by an imperialist right-wing power. So they're an attack on one in that regard is an attack on all. So they're fighting for the freedom of freedom-loving people everywhere. I was just a little redundant in that, but I hope you take that to heart.
Well, I appreciate that. We're gonna finish up here in a second, but if you have any final statements to make, like the one you just made earlier, you feel free to make your any conversations, and then or promote your stuff.
That was it, man. I'm Mustache Bob 2 on Twitter. If you're Mustache Bob 1, I need you to find me, and we need to fight over the screen name. Well, we'll meet in New York on top of the Silver Cup building. It'll be like the Highlander. Probably too young to get that one. Mustache Mafia on YouTube. I'll be putting out a little more content hopefully soon. I hope you guys enjoyed listening to the dulcet sounds of my voice, and I hope I was a little bit informative on this subject.
Well, thanks again for coming on. I really, really appreciate this. If you ever want to come on and discuss anything else, feel free to do so. I always am happy to have reoccurring guests on my show.
Well, thanks for having me, man.
My pleasure. This interview will be up on the YouTube as well as the podcast, since Spotify has given me the ability to actually upload video content. So take a look out for that. I might be posting clips of this as well, but there will be a full video on YouTube as well.
Connor's bigger than Joe Rogan, confirmed.
Thank you very much, guys, and have a wonderful day. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this interview despite the heavy topic, but I really enjoyed it, and it felt like a very informative conversation that I could use to not only look over and research Ukraine's conflict, but also help other people understand it as well. If you enjoyed, feel free to look at the Mustache Mafia podcast on his YouTube channel, as well as sharing this video around on your own social media. Thanks again for watching, and have a wonderful day.